We talked about that and then I promptly forgot. Thank you. So we are now actually recording and it will be recorded. So again, if you wish not to be recorded, send a request through chat or or turn off your camera. So on to the plan. Hopefully you or your clients have some kind of plan for what either life is going to look like in a remote environment and returning some or all of your employees as allowed by your jurisdiction and applicable laws into the workplace. And so we know we have a whole new vocabulary, many of us, all of us since COVID, social distancing, PPE, which we now know and roll us off our tongue as though we used to say that forever. Health and temperature checks, are you going to do them? How are you going to do them? And one of the things that Dana and I definitely spend some time thinking about is compliance with HIPAA, because believe it or not, if I stick a scanner on Dana's forehead and learn that she's 97.4 right now, that's protected health information. And I can't put that on the same piece of paper where I put Joan's temperature of 98.2. So not commingling employee health information. Obviously, what's your cleaning plan? What's your building's cleaning plan if you're a tenant? How are you going to handle meetings? There's some guidance in the jurisdictions about how many people you can have. What are you going to do? Are you going to hold them inside? Is outside an option? For those of us fortunate enough to be in California, we can probably hold outdoor meetings for a while. Can you in the middle of a hurricane in New York? Probably not. Is it a Zoom plan? Are you going to use different technology? Is that conceivable? How are you going to handle not only business travel, but even at the top of this call, people were talking about going to Vegas or going to different places. What are you going to do when your employee informs you, as mine did, oh, hey, I'm going to Jamaica tomorrow? Really? You're going to Jamaica tomorrow? Okay. So, those challenges.
Yes, and I'm thinking, even when I think about the things that I'm starting to hear in our office, when it comes to things like, temperature checks and whether you're an organization where you have a workforce that's dispersed, and kind of this idea, well, are we tracking information? How are we communicating if we're doing temperature checks or we're doing daily questionnaires before people are coming into the office? One good rule of advice that I've been sharing with clients is we don't ever want to be speaking in terms of test results. Amanda's negative, Dana's positive, she can't come to work. So you want to start focusing on using terms like eligibility for work, and that's it, as opposed to people being positive or negative. What I also think is very interesting is employers are having to do something they've never done before. And there isn't a whole ton of guidance out there. So it has to be a very thoughtful process if you are going to go that route or you have clients going that route where they're doing temperature checks, because the way you set up that signage in the morning time, the way you're going to route people into the office, it needs to be one directional. You don't need everyone. If you've got 50 people coming into a facility at one time, all 50 of them shouldn't show up, because then you're going to have an issue with social distancing there and how you're going to have people line up. So you want to have staggered start times. So there are many, many things to consider as you're kind of maneuvering through this time that we've just never had to do that before. You want to jump on this one, Amanda, or?
I like to think about, this is where I put a little toe into Dana's universe, and I try to think a little bit about how you're interacting with your employees and what their roles are. Because once we understand what relationship and communication we should set up with our employees, which may be a little different in a remote universe than it was when we got to all just be on site together, is what's the role of the employee? And to successfully manage your employee, I think you really do have to know what their job is. Are they a producer or are they on the support team? So I can think of it just with respect to our little law firm. We have attorneys who are producing both revenue and producing work products, and then the administrative staff that's really supporting them. And which role do you sit in? And then once I understand what that is, then I can start to figure out how to support the employees in getting their work done. And for some, especially those in sales who spent a lot of time on the road, that's not happening so much anymore. So how are we going to do that? And actually, a recent question I just had this last week was from a group that has a nonprofit entity and a for-profit entity. And so can they cross over? Can they use their employees in between the two organizations now seamlessly? Which my short answer is maybe. But how are we gonna support the people, and knowing what their role is first. And second of all, clarifying expectations. I feel like we do a pretty good job in our society when we onboard people. We usually have a job posting. Sometimes we're even lucky enough to have a job description. But now it is really important that you clarify what it is that you want. I have a client who is doing mandatory Zooms at 9 a.m., 12 p.m., and 5 p.m. If you're requiring your entire staff to be on a Zoom 3 times a day, suggests to me there's maybe a trust issue and maybe a little disconnect on what the real expectations are, because spending 3 hours with each other on Zoom per day is probably not really what the goal is. Want to do that? 3 hours on Zoom, 3 meetings a day with each other, mind you. And then the last piece is you have to think about who you have, like even on a Zoom like this. There's somebody who is that kid in the classroom that's going to wave their hands madly and wants to jump in and wants to participate. They were the ones sitting in the front desk. You know who they were. I was probably that kid. Some of you might have been. And then there's the one who sits quietly in the back, but might have so much to contribute. But if you don't go and ask, you might not get it. And you might not get it remotely. So really starting to think about who's in your workforce, who's on your team, what's their role, clarifying, come in and clarify one-on-one to the best that you can, what you expect, and then really try to understand how you're going to get the best success with communication with them. Dana, anything you want to add to that right there?
No, I think that's really good. I was probably the kid in the back, like, I have so much to share, but I'm so shy. Amanda and I have talked a lot about, although this is a new normal for us, there are certain things that still apply. And so all of the old labor laws and rules that we had to follow before, we still have to follow, even though we may have most of our workforce at home, or maybe a hybrid where some are in the office and some are at home. One of which is the FFRCA. And I've got Corey wanting to come in and I can't see my slides. So I'm going to click right there. That's why I keep moving it. Joan, can I admit him so I could get him off of my screen? He's in. Come on in, Corey. So that for all of you who may or may not be familiar, this was new rules that we had to follow that came into effect April 1st. And it basically did 3 things. One, it expanded FMLA, which is a big deal because if you're a larger nonprofit with over 50 employees, you already had to deal with the FMLA. But with the FFRCA, now if you were under 50 employees, FMLA was dramatically brought into your life. And the reason that this would come into play is if we had employees who perhaps had childcare or schools that were closing, because remember, schools had to pivot immediately and they all were not available or ready to just go to online classes. And so if you were a parent with maybe multiple kids at home and your school was no longer open, or you just have multiple kids and you could not balance the two with working, some people had, they now had the legal right to take time off up to 12 weeks. It was unpaid leave, but they could take that 12 weeks nonetheless. And if you were less than 50 employees, that just was not part of your vernacular. You never had to deal with that. And so these laws are still with us and will be at least through December 31st. And so we're in the summer now and it's kind of tapered off, but as we go into the fall and we know that many schools certainly are not coming back and they have a plan for online schools, but I think a lot of schools are still trying to figure it out. Just be aware if you have an employee saying, I need to take some time off because I have a childcare issue, or there's some confusion with my child's school and they're not in, before you say, I'm so sorry, we can't accommodate you, you may very well have an obligation to accommodate under the FFRCA. There was also an additional 80 hours of paid sick leave that was now available to people for COVID-related issues. And this is on top of any sick time or PTO that you may have currently been offering within your nonprofit. So if someone had to do maybe a mandatory self-isolation for 10 or 14 days, they could get paid sick leave that the employer would have to provide. You may say, well, gosh, we don't offer 80 hours of sick time, we only offer 40. You still had to provide that time. So it's very, very important that you were working with your payroll company if you did have to provide those 80 hours of paid sick leave, because they need to be coded a very specific way, because on the back end, the employer could reap a tax credit if they were having to provide that time. I would be shocked if you had any clients who were not having to offer that 80 hours of paid sick leave. And if they didn't do it during the first wave, from March to now, I don't think, hope, I don't know if we're halfway through this or this is just the start of the second wave, but they will likely have to encounter this at some point. Even as a boutique firm, we encountered it where we had to pay out those 80 hours of paid sick leave because at some point you're going to have someone who has to self-isolate because they've had a confirmed test. They have a family member who they need to care for who has a confirmed test, or maybe they have some type of a childcare issue that I described where the school is closed, or maybe as part of the jurisdiction where they live, there's a mandatory, shelter in place like we saw back in March.
Hey, Dana, I just want to, there was a question in the chat and you addressed it, but I just want to make sure we put a pin in it in terms of, especially in California where we know the schools are closed and a lot of employees don't necessarily have other childcare options. They were counting on their kids being in school and the after school programming. So number one is to make sure, as Dana, you said very clearly, that you are offering that expanded FMLA leave, which can go up to 12 weeks. And by the way, is capped at 10 grand. So just so you have a sense as the employer, what your liability might look like. And after they've exhausted that, then comes the question of whether or not you're going to potentially offer them an unpaid leave, if that is reasonable. But at some point, and this is just a dichotomy in the real world that we live in, at some point you are allowed under the law to compel them to work and find a child care solution. Realistically, is that going to happen? And practically speaking, we're all going to find out together. But first step up is definitely the expanded family medical leave.
Yeah, it's a good point. And we'll talk more about it too, setting expectations with your managers or how they're interacting with your team. And really never losing sight of the fact that we are in a pandemic. We have not experienced this before. And there are some of us who are coping well, but I guarantee you with your clients or even with your own employees, there are many who are still not coping well. I was very excited to see my mother. I saw her in April because I really thought, my mom was like, yeah, babe, see you in 2021. My mom is like, seriously not coming outside. So there are some people who are still and will continue to really struggle with this. Also in COVID, there are some monetary and health insurance benefits that have changed as it relates to the pandemic. We have probably all heard about what's happening with unemployment insurance. And if you haven't, there has been an additional federal supplement on unemployment. So many people back in March who were either furloughed or lost their jobs due to some type of COVID-related situation, they could claim upwards of an additional $600 a week in unemployment. And what a time when someone really needs it. But that also created havoc for many small businesses and nonprofits as well, is because employees who may have been temporarily furloughed who are now collecting this additional $600 a week in aid when it was time to come back to work and the furlough was over. There was a lot of resistance in doing that, a lot of animosity with the employer, because in some cases employees were making more on unemployment than they were when they were still working. That has since ended effective July 31st. It may still come back in some form. There's still the HERO Act, which is another stimulus package, and then there's the HEALS Act. The HERO was going to expand the $600 and continue it, expand it for a longer period of time, or HEALS is going to reduce that supplement to $200. And this is still a dilemma between the House and the Senate, and we probably will see something landing somewhere in the middle. It probably will not be that $600 again, but it is going to be something. So it's just, your clients have to be very, very aware that there's this tug of war as well for people who are, kind of taking this month by month, and they're going through rolling furloughs, and sometimes it's difficult to pull people back when they're on the unemployment. Other things that have changed for this year, 401k loans and distributions, there's some new rules around that. People can pull from their 401k and not receive the full, basically 30% penalty that you have in the past. So if you're not familiar with that, your clients will want to talk with their 401k record keepers to make sure that they're aware of those new rules surrounding that. And the same thing goes for COBRA as well. There's some extension in terms of the deadlines. If someone is losing benefits or losing a job during this COVID climate, where there was always a very set period of time to where you had to elect COBRA and then make your first payment within 45 days, those timelines are significantly stretched out, and that matters for your clients who are administering their benefits. And so they need to understand that, so they don't assume that, oh, I did not receive that first COBRA payment, that person may not want it. Not so much of a big deal because a lot of people are using third-party administrators for their COBRA. We always recommend that you do that, but some folks are still doing it in-house by themselves, so they need to be aware that there's some significant changes as it relates to COBRA. I kind of think we talked about this. There's some extended work from home challenges. I mean, first it was, how do we manage the pivot from working in the office to going home? Then it was, how do we manage pulling people back in who are afraid, who are on unemployment and it's been lucrative, who just have gotten used to this kind of lifestyle. And then there's kind of this hybrid situation where some are working in the office and some are at home. In our firm, that's what we're doing. We're trying to keep the office environment as safe and healthy and sanitized as possible. So those in essential roles where maybe there's an issue of confidential information, they are coming into the office. And those who can comfortably do the job from home, they are. And I think we're going to keep it like that for a period of time. So just be aware that there are challenges even that comes with that when you're trying to accommodate people, because you will have some people saying, well, gosh, why come that department gets to work from home, but I have to come into the office? And then on the flip side, there are issues for those who are in the office and those who are at home. That isn't always the best deal either, because there's missed career opportunities that people who are back in the office are having that those who are working from home not so much. Because we know when you're in the office, there's all these opportunities for immediate check-ins with people that when you're at home, it's just a lot more work. Like, I got to get on someone's calendar, I got to ping them, or I've got to email them, I got to set a Zoom. Oh, they in Zoom all day long, they don't have time to meet, and I've lost a whole day. So these are things to consider. Longer project management cycles. I've been doing investigations in COVID fully remote, and they take significantly longer because you're having to interview people, you're having to find time, and then you may have to sync up with the group, and their calendar is full, so it may not be till 5 o'clock that day, and you're waiting all day. Normally, if I was there, I could just go to people and ping them and talk to them. I could set a whole day in a client's location and interview everyone I need. But when you're doing these things remote, they do take time. I think it's interesting that you're finding some employees are actually moving, people who are living in the LA area, and if they're not bound to a mortgage, and the employer has said, we're out the rest of the year, people are moving back with family to maybe save dollars. They may be moving to an area that they perceive as less risk from COVID. So just be aware of that. I don't know if anyone heard, at Facebook, or I think Google said they're not coming back till June, and Facebook has a long-term remote work from home policy as well. But I guess Mark Zuckerberg said, but those of you who work in the Silicon Valley and we find out that you move, we're going to reduce your pay. I thought, gosh, that's not very nice. I guess the idea was that they're getting paid because they work in the Valley, and if they go to Montana for the next 6 months, that they're going to reduce their pay.
No, but I would say on this point, today I talked to a client who has 4 employees that are planning to leave the state of California. Knowing where your employees are is probably valuable. Also, not so much because you're going to reduce their pay, but one of the issues that came up for the client is when they do go back to the office, do they now have to pay expenses to fly somebody from Colorado back to their offices in San Diego or Los Angeles? Do they have to fly them from Philadelphia? What happens if they move 2 hours east of LA? And do they now have to pay for that commute? So do know where your employees are going and make sure that you have some dialogue around it so that you know what to prepare for and to prepare them for, and so that you have clear expectations. Maureen, do you
also have an interesting situation? If somebody's now working from Montana, you have to add Montana to your work comp policy. Their place of employment has changed.
And taxes.
So yeah, their taxes are changed, but from a work comp standpoint, let's say somebody goes up to Seattle, that's great. That's a monopolistic state. You need to remember that stuff. So,
if you even know it, to Maureen's point.
yeah.
And then, just like Amanda said, people are going to be taxed differently in Montana than they are in California. So it presents a challenge when employees are making these decisions and they're not telling their employers. So what's the solution? I mean, if you know that you're going to have a long-term work from home, like if you know people are not coming back until January, there's nothing wrong with saying that. You can say that and still say that even that is not a guarantee, but our plan is you guys are going to be work from home until January. That could change, but it does, in my opinion, give people some opportunities to make some decisions on, okay, what's best for us when we have school coming and this is all going to be remote, and maybe I do need to be closer to grandparents who can help with the caregiving of the kid, all kind of things that people are considering.
And by the way, a reminder that most employee handbooks and most employers say, whether it's in an employee handbook or not, hey, you have an obligation to let us know when you change your address, even if you're moving a block away. So it's not a different obligation, whether you're moving a block or you're moving to Montana.
So true. And then in the chat, there was a question about, workers' comp claims to begin with. And we do have a slide on that. But I think Amanda can speak to it even more. But yeah, from my understanding is that we can't just absolve our hands of workers' comp issues and say, if we have all of our folks working from home, we no longer have any concerns about liability since we're not controlling the workspace that our employees are in. And my understanding is that's not the case. And I don't know, Amanda, if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, so we do get to, we don't have to provide, for example, the furniture or the ergonomic assessment, but we still have an obligation to ensure that there is a safe work environment and to tell our employees, hey, you have to provide a safe work environment, and if something is going on, we need to know about it. If they left their own banana peel on the floor by themselves in an environment that we can't control, more likely than not, and I won't become an insurance provider, or agent or broker, but more likely than not, they won't end up having to cover that claim. But if the employee is repeatedly telling you, hey, that laptop isn't going to work, or I need a bigger keyboard, or I need something like that, something to consider. And as someone pointed out, workers' comp, I think de facto through the end of 2020 is going to cover remote work. That's another decision that everyone made.
A quick question is
another thing on work comp. It is weird at home because workers' comp is very what you call applicant oriented. So it's hard to say where your day starts and stops sometimes, or, let's say you're heading to your bathroom. If I were to walk out my office door, my dog likes to lay in the doorway. If I trip over Sophie, it could be iffy. So there's that problem. And also the reclassification. So if you had people, outside salespeople, and they're now working from home, you can dump them into clerical, which is a slightly different premium. I have a theater that's now strictly remotely. They're doing work online. The whole group's going clerical. We can make those changes with the carrier. It's allowed. And they were thinking about coming up with a work from home rate, but I don't know that would be any less expensive than clerical. So,
but Maureen, you make an excellent point, and we've had people who have converted from full-time status to something that's less than full-time, which also destroys that exempt classification. So making sure that you're documenting somebody who maybe was making $55,000 a year in a job that was exempt, but has now dropped to a $48,000 rate of pay, then we're going to need to make sure we're documenting classification and converting them to an hourly rate of pay.
Right, the sign in.
And not reclassifying people because a manager distrusts issues of productivity. So if we're reclassifying an exempt position to non-exempt because the duty or the role has changed, then yes, we can do that. But just taking your exempt people and saying, okay, I'm going to reclassify them to hourly, because I think, they're only working 38 hours a day and I only want to pay for 38 hours a week, and I only want to pay for 38 instead of 40. That's not the approach that we'd like our clients to take. It starts and it comes from a position of distrust.
one question back to the moving cross-state. Is the litmus test whether they actually gave up the current address, let's say it's going to the grandma's place from California to Oregon, they're staying with grandma for a while, but they are keeping their location in California without changing any of their mailing and all that. Is there a time limit as how long they can do that before they're classified as being an Oregon employee?
So I'm going to stay in my lane as an employment lawyer and not a tax lawyer. However, I'm going to also share a few tidbits that I've learned over time with a lot of these questions. California and most states, but I can speak obviously most eloquently to California. California is going to look at where the domicile is. So where's the tax being paid? They'll look at everything from where's the car registered, where's the car physically garaged, all of those kinds of things. And California does, in particular, just having a few clients who hop from California to New York, have very specific rules on the time limits that are spent in each place. And from an employment law perspective, the way that it would impact is the laws of the state in which the employee is domiciled are going to be deemed to apply to that employee. So it is definitely something that as the employer, you want to know about.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great question.
So Amanda, how do you want to cover this slide?
Yeah, more questions. To the extent that others of you have more questions that you want to jump in with, we're happy to answer those. These are some that Dana and I hear, I don't know how many times a day, Dana, we could probably
Quite a bit.
Yeah, quite a bit. As summer is winding to a close, the childcare leave, I think we actually talked about that one. Dana, I think you should talk about PPE and whether masks qualify as, do you have your favorite device with you or not?
Well, you know what? I think I want to talk about this one at the bottom because I'm hearing this. We're back at work now, but one of my new employees has contracted the virus. Now what? I'm getting a lot of questions surrounding that. And so here's how we've seen it shift. You know, when this first started back in March and there were confirmed COVID cases in the workplace, the protocol was the employee would go to the doctor, they'd be tested, the doctor would notify the Department of Health, the Department of Health would contact the employer, and the Department of Health would conduct contact tracing on the employer's behalf. That's gone out the window now because Department of Health simply doesn't have the bandwidth to do that. But as we are all starting to go back into the workplace, some of us in some way, shape, or form, you know, we're at risk of this. We're going to have a confirmed case. So it is incumbent upon employers to be prepared to do some form of contact tracing on their own. Waiting for the Department of Health to come in and do that is probably not an option anymore. And so there's some important things that employers should consider if they're having to do contact tracing. One of the things we see people doing is truly limiting how people move within a building. So, you know, if you have people, let's say you had like 2 floors, it doesn't mean people can't go from floor to floor, but trying to limit people's movement. So in the event that you do have a confirmed case on one floor, you know, okay, I'm dealing with people on this, in this particular department or this floor, as opposed to an entire building. You also want to make sure that, again, you're protecting people's health information. Where we've seen it go south is employees freak out when they hear someone has a confirmed case. The employer starts to help with this contact tracing, which means they have to go back to the employee with a confirmed case and say, the 3 days before you felt any symptoms, let's go through your calendar, let's go through your meetings, who were you around? And as the employer goes through those steps, the employee says, well, I did sit with this new employee who just started. We were social distance, you know, we had our masks on, but I did, you know, sit more than 15 minutes with this person. Now the employer needs to go back to that employee and say, hey, it's possible that you've come in contact with someone with a confirmed case. I can't share with you the name of that person, but we're recommending that you take the day and you go to your doctor and get tested, and then follow the directions of your doctor at that point. And usually the doctor is going to say, even if that person doesn't have any symptoms, to self-isolate for at least 10 days. That's the new guidance from the CDC. The challenge is that people become unglued because they want to know the name of the person with a confirmed case. And if that person shares it, that's fine. If they even figure it out because of process of elimination, there's 5 of us in the office and one's only there, you know, one is not there anymore, that's fine. But as the employer, you don't have an obligation to say, you know, it was Amy who has the confirmed case. But you do have an obligation to notify employees who may have come in contact with them so that they can now go see their doctor and get instructions from their physician.
And having a notice ready to go, we have deployed it now for many, many clients. Doesn't need to be lengthy, but a notification, there has been a confirmed case. Please take appropriate steps. Please monitor yourself without disclosing the employee name, for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's keep going in the interest of time. And Joan, please tell us if we're, because we wanted to probably just do have a couple more slides that we'd like to get through. Okay. Amanda? Me? Amanda?
I just need to move my my images over so I can actually see that. Okay. There we go. Well, so one of the questions I'm still fielding is, what does the shelter in place, what does the governor's order or the local county's order mean to us? Can we return to work at all? So first question, when you're looking at somebody who's reluctant to return, which many people may have already experienced, is there an order preventing the return to work? Because we do not want to be in a situation where, for example, it's a hairstylist and the stylist is not actually allowed to return to work. We don't want to then compel that stylist to return to work. The second question is, can the job duties be performed remotely? And for those who may not have had the pleasure of reading the now, I don't know, it's like 48 pages now, Dana, I think, health order. If you haven't had the pleasure of reading it, it says specifically that those who can perform their work remotely should be directed, that's the word, the verb, directed to do so. The next question to look at will be, are there any special circumstances that apply to the employee? For example, I had a phone call where somebody was told to return to work. I spoke to the employee. He went and provided a medical note saying it would cause him undue anxiety and stress based on health circumstances in his household for him to return to work. And the employer's response was, oh, you're not coming back? Yeah, you've been here for 14 years. Thanks a lot, you're fired. He has, as you might imagine, a relatively good case for disability discrimination. So taking a look at special circumstances and do they apply to that employee?
Yep.
And then, of course, the things that we talked about at the outset of this, which is, have you taken, as the employer, all the reasonable steps that you should take? Do you have the signage Dana referred to? Do you have directional ins and outs if you have a lot of people coming in and out of the workplace? And what's your social distancing inside the workplace?
Yep. Good stuff. Like we said earlier, employment laws still apply to employees, whether you have kind of that hybrid mix, where you have some in the office and some at home, or whether you guys are still at home until further notice. So employees are still entitled to receive, their meal periods, their rest breaks. If you have hourly people at home, then you want to make sure that whatever time and attendance system you're using is able to capture and track the same as it did when they came into the office. So we've seen a lot of that where clients are just changing their time and attendance system altogether, because they may have, even when people were in the office, they may have had a system that was very tactical and multiple people touching the same biometric scan or anything like that. So they're moving away from that as altogether. So you don't have the same people touching the same scan or the same workstation over and over and all day. But if it's a web clock or a web-based system, you'll have to change the IP. So the IP address security on it so that people can clock in from home, because normally that's a feature where you can't clock in unless you're in the employer's building. Overtime still applies. If you haven't spoken to your hourly people about that, you cannot be over communicating during this time. People are still worried and concerned. They don't want to lose their jobs. So if you're sending hourly employees emails at 6 o'clock, unless you've been explicit that, hey, as your manager, sometimes I'm still working after hours, so you may get an email from me. There's absolutely no expectation that you work beyond 5 o'clock. If you haven't had those conversations with your hourly people, you should do that. Because people still need to be paid overtime, even in a pandemic. And while there were a lot of concerns and fears about productivity and lapse in productivity, I think we've seen just as much as the opposite, where people are just working harder. They're working longer because they are at home. So there should not be an expectation necessarily that, oh, now, people are just languishing at home and not getting their work done. We just haven't seen that. Reimbursements, I know Amanda's going to talk about that on the next slide. We talked about paid sick leave and the emergency paid sick leave. And then we also talked about workers' comp, which I understand there's now a presumption if someone gets a COVID test and they're working, that it could potentially have come from work. So that, I think those are important questions to be asking, your brokers to be, if you're working with someone like a Maureen, to say, hey, if someone does have a confirmed test and it happens at work, or they're physically working and then they come down with a confirmed test, do we have to file or do we have to notify our insurance carrier of that?
And I just want to say, just on this slide, that the wage order does not care that your employee is working from home, and the wage order still requires that all hours work be recorded, including meal periods. And the wage order is so specific that it says that they must be recorded in indelible ink. There is no absolution from that wage order. So we're recording time and recording overtime. So this is also, this is not unique to California, but we're kind of out on the forefront for those of you in different states, although New York also has some similar rules, and so does Massachusetts, actually. But if we are requiring, and even though it's not us necessarily requiring, the government is requiring our employees to work from home, we have an obligation to reimburse our employees for any necessary expenses that they incur. This is straight from the California Labor Code. So it's not just something we made up. The big question, many of you already have been thought about, or your clients have already thought about reimbursing for a phone and providing a computer. But I will tell you, I'd say almost at least once a week, I have somebody call me and they're not reimbursing for this device whatsoever. And unless you did this, which after a lot of thinking and saying I would never do it, I sent the actual physical phones home with every single employee from my office so they can plug into the internet at home just as if they're in the office, and we can use our internal extensions just the same way. I'm paying for that phone and I'm paying for that phone line, but I'm not paying for their internet at home. So therefore I'm going to have to make a reimbursement for the use of their internet. I generally will tell you the safest place you can possibly be as an employer is to provide the equipment. You can make reimbursements, but if the equipment is yours and it belongs to you, it's a pretty easy argument that you didn't compel them to be on something that you didn't pay for.
That's a good point.
The safest road. The safest.
Question on the internet, because everybody pretty much has internet anyway. You're already buying it. It's not going to, depending on your plan, I'm assuming it doesn't cost any more to work from home versus not work from home on your internet.
Amazing, right?
What percentage are employers expected to pay of that?
So it's a great question, and it's one I've spent some time and heart and soul on. You can do a few different things. You can survey employees, for example. It's not, and there's question marks about whether you want to survey your employees. Some people do. I decided that I would be a test case, and I did it. I would say, just to give you real-time dollars for at least the city of Los Angeles, we're seeing reimbursements that range generally from $20 to about $75 per month on the, do you agree with that, Dana? Do you think that's about what you're seeing on internet?
Yeah, or sometimes I'll see a reimbursement on people who say I need to upgrade my internet.
Yes.
So they had internet before, but they're saying I need to go to the next level. And then what we've done is we've basically said, hey, we're at a place now where you can come back into the office. We feel confident that we can keep the office sanitized, but we're giving you the option to remain at home. So, we've kind of done that where if people were just like, yeah, I'm fine with remaining at home, we've sent them with the company phone, just like Amanda said, where they just plug right in. And we've kind of worked it like that. But I completely agree. You can't go wrong by just at least having some type of stipend that you're saying, hey, we're awarding you $40 a month, for incidentals. If at any point your expenses go over that, or you think that's not an appropriate amount, we always come back and talk about this. This isn't hard in stone and can never be changed.
And Maureen, just to directly answer your question, because you are requiring them to use the internet, even though they had it anyway, and even though it's not costing them anything extra, under a strict interpretation of this labor code section, there's a pretty good argument that you have to reimburse them anyway.
Dana, I have a question on the internet services. Like you said that most of the times families have to upgrade, right? Because everyone's on Zoom, kids and adults both.
Yeah.
So have you seen any discrepancy between one employee is offered and the other is not? Is it such kind of a rule, or is it very each employer focused that they create their own rule that they are going to reimburse one employee or maybe all the VPs and not the other employees who do not need to be on call for the whole time?
Yeah, so normally when it comes to any type of HR policy, we always want to make sure that there's a fair and consistent application of the policy across the board.
Sure.
When it comes to policy, and this would be no different. I think what actually happens in practice is just the opposite of what you described. What I've seen, and I can't even say this across the board, maybe the executives are less worried about it and they're not availing themselves of a reimbursement that the employer says that they will provide. And maybe more of your lower paid workers are fully availing themselves for that. And that's fine. It's their prerogative. If they feel like they don't want to run it through an expense, that's fine. But I would not do onesies, twosies. I would definitely say, across the board, this is our policy and it's available to everyone who's working from home.
You could break it. The only caveat to that would be you could break it by employee classification. You could do one plan for executive level, a plan for your outside sales where, for example, they're really, really heavy users. But as Dana said, you have to look and make sure that the application, and I love your word choice, Dana, is fair and consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And are they putting all these policies, adding them into their employee handbook, or they're posting it and making it available to employees?
So for our clients, we're mostly doing it as a supplemental policy as opposed to doing it in the employee handbook, but we are adding for most of our clients an FFCRA, the emergency paid sick leave, emergency paid family leave, remote workplace, and COVID related guidelines.
Yeah. Because when we first started this, we all thought, 60 days. And then here we are, 4 months later. So I think at minimum, then we started thinking, okay, December 31st, most of this will change. And now it's like, I don't know. I think we'll be continuing with a lot of these policies.
Well, and so to answer, I just want to answer the question that came across the chat, which is a great question. If you all of a sudden had a revelation and you're like, oh God, I needed to be paying for what I wasn't paying for in the back behind this, in the past, my feeling is go in, do a little bit of a mea culpa without acknowledging anything per se, but just be like, listen, we've come to a realization. This is what the world looks like for a little while. So we're not only going to pay you $20 a month going forward, but we're actually going to retroactively make this right. Own it. The world's changing. We don't all exactly know how the world is changing minute by minute. So own it and fix it. And I feel like that takes you everywhere.
So true. I think this is our last slide. And then if we have any more questions, we're happy to take them. Just some final tips for promoting harmony in the workplace. Just keeping in mind that some people still are not okay. And some people have learned to adjust, but many have not. Many people have coping behaviors and they don't even know that they have these coping behaviors and how they're trying to address. For those of us who don't have the lucky benefit of having school-age kids at home, I'm not saying to other those employees and treat them differently, but I try and remain sensitive to that because that's not my situation. And that's a whole nother burden. And it doesn't matter, people are working with kids and animals and they've got people with compromised immune systems. They're worried about their parents. So make sure that trickles down in your operations, not only for you as senior leaders, but then also for your line staff. And so they just don't forget that we still need to be sensitive to this pandemic. And that relates to having a lack of awareness and sympathy for social injustice issues as well. There's so many other things that are happening in our country at the same time as a pandemic. And so you will have employees who are very burdened while they're still trying to work. They're worried about societal issues and they're worried about this pandemic. And they're anxious. They're not able to do the things that they always love to do, particularly in the summertime. Managing your manager's expectations is key. You know, coming down real heavy-handed. No offense to Amanda's client, but I'm like, a Zoom call 3 times a day just to kind of check in with people feels like overkill to me. And try not to wear people out with the Zoom as well. I think we were doing all these cool things at first. We were having Zoom, you know, happy hours, and people were having Zoom, you know, theme meetings. It's sports day, it's favorite college day, it's hat day, and all that's fine. But I think we are going to have to continue to evolve, and this is going to continue to change. Now I'm understanding people are doing, you know, cooking events as a way to keep employees engaged, or they're doing, you know, wine tasting, sending samples to people's homes, which I really like that. So we're going to have to continue to be creative and continue to recognize that what we're doing today, you know, April 6th, we may have to be doing something different September 6th. We talked a lot about employee productivity, annual performance cycles. This, if you do these regularly, sometimes our fiscal year may have already passed, but if it's coming up in December, and this is your annual performance cycle, is also tied to salary increases that may or may not happen with our nonprofit clients. But this may be the year where you perhaps tweak your performance cycle, taking into consideration that employees may not have been their best self for Q2 and on. People may have missed marks, they may have missed their goals, and you may even want to push that off for another year. And then finally, vacation and time off requests. Just keep in mind, people still do want them. And I hear a lot of employers saying, yeah, we're telling people take the time, but make sure that that's not just lip service, and that it's reflected in the actions of the manager as well, that they don't kind of poo-poo on people who do take vacation, even though kind of the global messaging is that you still can take vacation even if you're work from home.
I think that sort of concludes what we formally had to say. We're happy to take questions, and also happy, I think, Dana, at this point to stop the recording for those who might want to ask a question but prefer not to have it be recorded. So Joan, if you want to stop the recording at this point, and if anybody wants to ask a question that